back to the show Anarchy. In this episode, Georgina and I are going to introduce a very special guest. As many of you viewers may know, in the beginning of this series many years ago, we had a famous writer join us, Samuel P. Huntington. Huntington was a political scientist from Harvard University. Huntington was famous for his publication of the book Clash of Civilizations. In this book, he developed the theory of the Clash of Civilizations. The theory emphasized that cultural and religious identities around the world would be the ultimate birthplace of conflict in the post-Cold War era. Huntington argued that wars in the future would no longer be fought between countries, but rather between cultures. One of Huntington's famous quotes is, "In the emerging world of ethnic conflict and civilizational clash, Western belief in the universality of Western culture suffers three problems. It is false, it is immoral, and it is dangerous." Samuel Huntington died on Martha's Vineyard, where his death was announced by Harvard University. He was 81 years old. Although he is deceased, his argument is very much still alive and relevant between international relations scholars today. Georgina, do you recall when Huntington made his first appearance?
So, the beginning of Huntington's argument began in 1993 in an article written by Foreign Affairs. He later expanded his argument into his book in 1996, and it was quickly translated into over 35 languages. Again, Huntington stressed that in a post-Cold War world, conflict would not derive from ideological friction between nations, but rather conflict would occur from cultural and religious differences among the world's major civilizations. According to an article written by the New York Times, written about Samuel Huntington, it explains that the world's major civilizations, he argued, were categorized as Western, including the United States and Europe, Latin American, Islamic, African, and Orthodox, as Russia as the core state, Hindu, Japanese, and Sinic, including China, Korea, and Vietnam.
So the central premises of our paper isn't that Huntington was wrong in the sense that there will be a clash. We believe that there will be a clash. However, we add on to that the clash isn't going to occur between civilizations, but rather it's going to occur between identities. And the reason why we think that's very important is because we think this is really the overarching conflict that's happening right now. So, what identity is this? The identity is the one that's developing within the globalistic system that we see our world currently inhabiting, because it's becoming more interconnected. The internet is connecting more and more people. There's less boundaries between groups of people, that because of that, a new identity is burgeoning, developing. You can see an example of this in humanism, a new viewpoint of people in relation to the rest of the world, the rest of the group. Where it comes into conflict is the internationalistic system, or the more nationalistic identity-based view of the world. And we see this particularly resurging within the world, within the context of almost reaction to this more globalistic identity developing. But we see that that's a very real thing, and that is where the conflict will happen. It won't be between civilizations, because between the civilizations, you can have a common identity almost. But you still have that conflict of more the developing identity, the new identity, conflicting with the older identity. So, how exactly do we develop this idea? Firstly, we want to go and orient ourselves into understanding the groups, understanding why groups are important in particular. So we look at Jonathan Haidt's research, an American psychologist, as well as look at a particular example of the group, but then how that's evolved. Then what we go into is look at where and why that would actually conflict, this newer growing identity and this older identity, more established identity, and why that would conflict, where we see historical examples of that conflicting. And then finally, we can take an example of state actors being very particularly concerned with this burgeoning identity. All right, so firstly, on groups. So if you look at the history of, in particular, the polity, the political group, what you see is this overarching aspect that it's constantly evolving, developing, becoming more nuanced, becoming more complex. A microcosm of an example is the American voting rights. Who within the United States is a part of the group who can vote, and then further from that can identify as American in particular. So we see this evolution of voting rights being relegated to one particular group, and then it expand outward to include more and more people within that group. And then furthermore, why groups are important is when we look at Jonathan Haidt's research, something he actually discovers and finds is, and he coins this in this particular way, that people are 90% ape while 10% bee. What he means by this is, though people are very individualistic, he was finding that there is still an ability, a switch almost, for people to become more groupish in behavior and how they think and how they act and what they do physically. But they can orient themselves in that way. And so when we remember that, and we remember that there are political groups that we can observably see throughout history, that these groups become more nuanced and complex, we see why those groups are important. And then we can see it conflicting with older groups and then newer developing groups. But a particular reason why that conflict would arise between these groups. Let's go into, it was in a debate presented between Brett Weinstein, an evolutionary biologist, and Richard Dawkins, another evolutionary biologist that you may know. One of the discussions talked about was the idea of replicators, and particularly replicators in the context of lineage. So if you don't know what a replicator is, it's basically what Dawkins termed genetics, that what he was finding almost is that genes wish to reproduce themselves. And that was a new burgeoning idea. And then what Brett Weinstein takes it further by then putting the context of, it was initially in this context, but we can extrapolate it to go beyond that pure context. What it was in the context of ethnic clashes between groups. That if there's a biological aspect of genetics which seeks self-reproduction or self-expression of the same genetic coding, that maybe that can metaphysically manifest itself into a more cultural perspective. And we can see this in various groups and various traditions, where there is very much so a desire to perform the same activities, to perform the traditions of your culture's ancestors, of your group's ancestors. And that possibly then, if we put things in the context of lineage, that maybe there is a natural antithetical reaction to these older traditions being pushed away in place to have established possibly newer things. Or if there is conflict there, we can see why that would be the case. That maybe culture manifests itself in a way that it seeks its own self-reproduction, and that we can see many aspects of life seeking its own self-reproduction. And so that's one idea. And so when we look back between globalism and internationalism, it makes sense because we remember, we can see very much so in today's context that there is the revitalization of indigenous cultures as well as the resurgence of nationalism. A state example is China becoming much more economically open. It simultaneously became much more nationalistic in its policies. What you can also see is the rise of far left and far right groups. Perhaps you could actually look at them, and then Brexit, of course, perhaps you can actually look at them being those wishing for the much more internationalistic system with clear boundaries and clear identities, and those wishing to go beyond the boundaries, go beyond the borders. So with the resurgence of these nationalistic views, the revitalization of indigenous cultures, of these new ways of thinking, we can start to put things in the context of, all right, we can understand that almost people have a desire to expand the group, while at the same time people have a desire to repeat the same functions and activities that their group and culture have always, or at least for a very long time, have been performing. And it then becomes understandable that conflict is going to be less between civilizations, but can be internally and externally, rather over identity in who you are and who you are in relation to the state or in relation to the rest of the world. Thank you.
All right, everyone, I would like to introduce our special guest, Michael Maston.
Welcome to the show.
Hello everyone, I'm happy to
introduce a new thesis to counter Huntington's argument, not really even counter so much as put a critique on Huntington's main thesis that there will be a clash of civilizations because of cultural differences and economic scarcity, but rather that this clash will occur through identity. I make this critique of a difference between identity and culture is because, especially in the modern world and throughout history, we see this evolution of identity, or at least how a person identifies himself in relation to the world around him. And so in today's world, what we're seeing, especially with this increasingly interconnected world, via trade, via organizations, international organizations, the UN, the internet, and just different apparatuses to connect people, that there's now starting to grow an identity from that, and that there's a sort of antithetical reaction of that. So right now, where instead Huntington made this statement of you're going to have clashes between different cultures, and the cultures more aligned with one another are going to align themselves, and they're going to create different civilizations, and you'll find on those borders that there'll be clashes. Right now, instead, while I am agreeing with him that there is going to be a clash along those sorts of borders, it's less so about culture, but more about identity, especially in the world as it's developing right now, because of the increasing interconnectedness, what that causes and what we can see from history, especially with the interaction of Europeans coming into indigenous cultures, indigenous lands, that there's a bit of an erosion of older identities or older cultures as they adopt to the new culture. So in this world we're now being in of increasing interconnectivity, that the struggle and the clash is going to be along the lines of the groups that are more willing to align with something that's more globalistic, less connected by national boundaries, less connected by prior cultural differences, and those other cultures, or not even those other cultures, but those other people that want to live in a more of an internationalist system, that want to retain their culture, retain their national boundaries, retain their traditional identities. And so how we can see it is the older system of more international, to each region their own religion, that's having a direct conflict now with the change into a more globalistic system, where those prior cultural boundaries are beginning to erode and sort of having an antithetical reaction, and that is inherently where the clash is coming from.
So would you say today in our day and age that due to our advances in technology and our interconnectivity between each other and having to keep up with what the next big thing is and what the next person next to you is doing and this and that, would you say that that itself is its own clash of civilizations within our modern day, and also causing a tension between the traditionalists and the modern day culture?
Not so much. If you're talking about the internet, what I'd rather see happening is just there's a rapid fire sort of evolution of culture in the context of each different group, because obviously Korean culture and the internet on Korea is a little bit different than the internet inside American, sort of like that meme culture, and we see differences there, but instead it just goes by a lot faster. So what we used to have after the 50s is each decade was its own particular unique thing, and that was due to a lot of consumer culture. But because of the increasing interconnectivity, you won't have those sorts of differences between the decades now, where if you think about it, each year after 2000s are much just have their own unique set. But rather we haven't seen any years coupled with each other that have a consistent culture through line. Rather, each year is its own different little thing with its own different references. And so that the internet, that increasing interconnectivity, just has a much more rapid cultural evolution.
So in a sense, culture is the vulture of modern day society.
Yes and no. I mean, again, culture is just the manifestations of humanity's intellectual ideas, its arts. And so rather than seeing culture as a vulture, we would see it just as a manifestation of the self. A really beneficial example, I think, of this concept between internationalism and globalism is looking at what the Russian political scientist Alexander Dugin had to say on this subject. Because really, as Americans, when we're viewing this, we come from this hegemonic culture. What does another culture, someone from another culture, which is also, we could argue, hegemonic, say about their world and globalistic perspective? Because it's definitely different from the Western perspective we have. And that's why I mentioned Alexander Dugin in this thesis. Because he goes a bit into the heartland theory and then expounds upon it further by talking about a civilization of land and a civilization of sea, or what we can gather is really just cultures of the land, cultures of the sea, that those are two distinct groups. But really, what I find interesting is that he defines the culture of the land as one that values conservatism, holism, collective anthropology, or the group over the individual that is more important, sacrifice, and in general has an idealistic orientation, pursues faithfulness, asceticism, honor, and loyalty. While he compares this with the culture of the sea being one that decentralizes power, with the culture of land must centralize power, the culture of the sea is dynamism. It's more fluid in its social and cultural values. I think it's interesting to look at that because a common criticism of the West, and you even see it in Huntington's book, is the amoral nature of the West, which then we can compare, all right, these are two different perspectives and two different takes, while they're at the same time recognizing common criticisms. So we can take those common criticisms out and then orient them in a new way. And that's why really I think this comes into perspective more, the pursuit and founding of a new identity, one that's more globalistic than currently one that's more internationalistic. And so again, if we reference back to Dugin, he talks about internationalism and Russia needing to expand its hegemonic influence so that it can promote internationalism, where his view is the West wants to promote globalism. And that's why, again, I come back to this conflict of identity, one that's more globalistic or one that's more in the Westphalian sense of internationalistic. And so I really see two different camps here fighting it out. And those different camps can be within different civilizations. And really, again, why I see these being two different train of thoughts is because we can go into the evolution of the polity, the political group, particularly why humans are very group-oriented, and we need to recognize that. Then we can go on into sort of the biological aspect of things, looking at possibly with the idea that religion is a byproduct of evolution, and that we do have a sense of replicators, and there's a curse of replicators. And then thirdly, we finally finish it out by looking at it from a particularly realistic perspective, where we can see right now what's happening around the world with different things happening, with nation states taking on different roles, that this is really what the central argument is in who ends up getting to shape that identity.
I see. So my question for you is, globalism and internationalism are often thought of as one. How would you define these two terms?
So really, I think we need to stay with more of the Westphalian philosophy of what internationalism is. So if we go back and reiterate the same quote, to each region their own religion, it's very much a nationalistic perspective that we want to have defined borders, defined cultural lines, and there's very much an us versus them, which isn't inherently a bad thing. Like, that's fine. But we're seeing it come into conflict because with the increasing technology and increasing attitude of people, there is definitely within each countries around the world a much more globalistic take and a desire to sort of erode cultural, social, language barriers, and that you end up having conflict between the two. And that's why I'm arguing that you see the rise of nationalistic groups in Europe, you see the rise of or revitalization of more indigenous cultures and just so forth around the world. We look at the works of psychologists, right? So take Jonathan Haidt. In his book, The Righteous Mind, he does a lot of studies and he extrapolates his idea that in order to create group unity, people have developed moral matrices in which they operate in, and that those moral matrices help to develop sort of just group unity by establishing sort of baselines. And from this, later in the book, he extrapolates further from his research that humans in his stance are 90% chimp, 10% bee, in that what you can find, particularly when you're having people perform group activities, that they can think and start to operate subconsciously in a very groupish way, that they can move together as a unit. And this makes sense if you take it from an evolutionary perspective of the group that can operate better with one another is going to be more fit, more capable of retaining assets, resources, and competing with other groups. And so this makes sense in a Darwinian perspective, why groups are very important for people. Group unity is important. And that's why we really begin to look even further at when we look at the history of humanity, the history of civilization. Just look at the development of the polity, the development of the political unit. People very much started out from a very tribalistic perspective. Look at ancient Rome and their constant fighting with Germanic tribes. Initially it was very ethnically based. However, there's this development and extrapolation of what it means to be this identity or to be within this culture. As Europe develops, as the rest of the world develops, really as humanity develops, you see the complexity of a political group develop even more. And as a state operates, you still need people to be willing to operate in a common thing. So if you standardize that, if you create a common identity, if you create a nationalistic identity, people then can think in similar ways, can think along similar lines, and can operate more as a unit. Everyone is still individual on their own ends, but we've created this overarching system that allows them to move as a group. So now they are a larger, more complex group, capable of more things, and capable of competing with other larger groups. And so we see this development.
So conflict is inevitable, but how it will happen, we shall see. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We
Thanks for
really
having me.
appreciate it.